My task today is to address the question of humanity as it relates to the paradigm that's been laid out for us today. 1 and 2 as it relates to humanity. My methodology will be this. I want to address humanity in the context of social ordering, social function, through the perspective and lenses of gospel truth and pagan lies. A few years ago, there was a debate that was conducted by the Beverly Hills Bar Association. I participated in that debate. It was just up the street at something called the Museum of Tolerance, an institution dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust. And in that debate, the question was, does the Constitution require us to redefine marriage? And we went back and forth, my debate opponent and so forth. At the end, a question was raised by this person in the audience, a sincere question. And the question was, David, asking my opponent, you've demanded these rights to marry someone of the same sex. My question for you is, what's the source of rights? David was very clear. He knew exactly that what wasn't the source of the rights. It wasn't morality, he said. It wasn't religion, he said. Then he hemmed and hawed and said, the source of rights is the state. To which I stood up, being the highly effective appellate advocate, and said, David, be careful what you just told these people, by the way, at the Museum of Tolerance, dedicated to the Holocaust, because what you told them is simply this. Nuremberg was wrong, and Dachau was right, because everything the Nazis did was legal. What's the real issue lurking here? The answer is, who or what is God? And that is an issue of cosmology. That is, the real issue is, what is the transcendent authority functioning or operating in the culture, and thereby within the culture's legal system? Why? Law expresses lordship. Show me the operational law of a culture, and I can show you what's driving that law. That is to say, what is the Lord of that culture? Because the Lord of that culture sanctions or approves the law of that culture. And that's particularly with respect to humanity, because law applies to the human person. The Apostle Paul confirms this analysis. He tells us this in the classic passage that Peter noted for us last night. Here's how I would say. Romans 1 tells us these particular aspects. It's an antithetical projection. The truth is suppressed. The truth is exchanged for the lie. That produces a spiritual response of worship. Creation is worshipped rather than the Creator. Creation is served rather than the Creator. This then produces behavior. Unrighteousness is practiced, and then ultimately unrighteousness is approved. And that approval process leads to greater suppression. Paul's analysis, his cosmology, his structure of real reality really provides the foundational points for assessing and understanding things like modern jurisprudence and policy as an implication of the truth being exchanged for the lie. Paul's cosmology teaches us two fundamental things. First, twoism teaches us that reality and therefore law has an inherent structure. Secondly, twoism teaches us there can be no neutrality with respect to that structure. So let's talk about both of those. First, Paul sets forth a two-option cosmology. What's really real? And this impacts what is law. He tells us that either there is the creator God of Scripture who makes the creation, he creates it ex nihilo, out of nothing, or there's simply monism, simply one, a single metaphysic. Paul's further point in Romans 1 is that one's cosmology, one's understanding of reality relates to behavior. And he tells us in that passage that sexual behavior is emblematic with respect to cosmology. You have the macrocosmology, then you have sexual behavior as an expression, an emblematic notion of what we might call a microcosmology. And this all impacts law and jurisprudence because worldview correlates with ethics. That impacts humanity. Here's why. In twoist reality, God is, as Peter said, holy. He is utterly other than his creation. There's a creator-creature distinction. The creator alone is independent, self-existent. We say he's aseity, his aseity. Now notice what happens when Paul takes these truths into the street, into the public square. For example, at Mars Hill in Athens, he says, how does he predicate things? He says, the God. Now your mind should ring there. He doesn't say some unknown deity. He says, the God, hearkening back to Romans 1:21. He says the pagans know the God. Notice ton theon. They know the God. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, creator, creation, being Lord. He's not a deist, far off. He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, as though he needed anything, because he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. He starts with the predicate of cosmology, that God is the creator. And thus only God is transcendent, and therefore only his law can be transcendent. Consequently, in this cosmology, this view of reality's structure, the creation, including what we call its positive law created by legislatures, the creation is necessarily dependent on and derivative from this independent, transcendent God. Paul makes this point when he takes it to the streets. Also, Acts 17, in him we live and move and have our being. Everything that we have is derivative from and dependent upon God. And therefore, because the Creator alone is transcendent, holy, and independent, his law, and necessarily, will properly be the proper transcendent authority. His law will be the law above the law. Some traditions would call this the natural law. Here's the point. Intuist reality, therefore, the collective of humanity, what we call the state, has a particular function. Oliver O'Donovan puts it this way. He says, the state exists in order to give judgment, but under the authority of Christ's rule, it gives judgment under law, never as its own. And he points out how this was radically different from the pagan era. He says, in particular, Christendom, some people reject that, they ought not. Christendom, in effect, refused the classical commonplace that the ruler was, quote, living law, his personal authority indistinguishable from the authority of the law he gave. We saw that very debate in discussing Justice Kavanaugh's theory of constitutionalism. Is it a living constitution, or is there a law above the law? It's the same issue. Thus O'Donovan concludes, law not only proceeds from the ruler, it precedes him. Accordingly, all earthly authority must be derived from above. That's exactly what Jesus told Pilate in court, in the public square. Do you remember? John 19, you'd have no authority over me unless it had been granted to you from above. So law, positive law, is neither autonomous nor independent. The question is, does it align with and cohere with the higher law, or does it not? Now, when a culture, and thus a legal system, functionally reduces who is God, what we might call reductionism, by embracing oneism, the result is not, well, there's no God in the culture. Rather, the result is the functional God will necessarily be found within the creation. That is a oneist move, and it creates a oneist ethics, leading to a firm oneist behavior. In other words, the creation, or some part of it, becomes operationally transcendent under oneist assumptions. Well, that is another move that creates problems. For example, Paul tells us that God is what? He is the creator and he's the redeemer. Okay, that's a good thing. But what happens when we reject the true and living God? We still have a creator, we still have a redeemer. But notice, the creator becomes the self and his or her own desires. Joseph alluded to that. Well, then who's the redeemer? The state, in order to confirm and affirm whatever the self desires. This explains why idolatry exists and why it's so damaging to a culture, because it contravenes reality's design. This alignment or misalignment produces real consequences. Now, unlike Peter Jones, who's brilliant but not grumpy, Chesterton is brilliant and grumpy. And he says, it is only by believing in God that we can ever criticize the government. Once abolish God, and the government becomes God. He continues, he says, wherever the people do not believe in something beyond the world, they will worship the world. Romans 1. But above all, they will worship the strongest. You see, ideas have consequences, especially unspoken ideas. And bad ideas have victims. And that's what we have when we exchange the truth for the lie. So, there's an inherent structure in this cosmology. And secondly, I said there's no neutrality. There can be no neutrality with respect to public norms. The scriptural writers understood this. Consider a vexing question the psalmist puts forth in Psalm 94. Can wicked rulers be allied with you? Why are they wicked? They frame injustice by statute. What's the assumptive language here? Well, positive law embraces a moral dimension. Secondly, positive law is a conduit for either just or unjust statutes. Thirdly, we need to make distinctions, even with respect to law and legislation. It's not good enough to say, well, it was legal what they did. Therefore, when the truth is exchanged for the lie, and oneism is embraced functionally, the lie concerning the public square and law and legislation consists in one aspect of the supposed neutrality of all things. You see, when someone asserts, you can't legislate morality, or that we need to be neutral in our jurisprudence, or that there's no such thing as a Christian public square, or there's no such thing as Christian culture, that's like someone taking a breath and saying there is no air. It's simply a cosmological impossibility. Therefore, the application of the lie to oneism is to contend that the public square is or can be neutral, that it's religion-free, that it's a morality-free zone. Or, put differently, the public square always reflects a theology and an ethic. Why? Because real reality consists of both theology and ethics. Thus, the question is never whether one will legislate morality. The question is whose morality will be legislated? Who or what will be the law above the human law? A friend of mine, Jonathan Burnside, I guess he's going to be on campus here in a few months, said this. He said, law is a backstage pass to theology. Henry Van Til put it this way, culture is religion externalized. Or as I've said it, law expresses lordship. Now, modern jurisprudence and expressions of this stem from onist assumptions. And what they do is they tend to affix transcendence, the law above the law, in one of two places, as I alluded. Idolizing the state, worshiping the state, the collective humanity, or idolizing the self, the individual humanity. Now, when that happens, what are the indicias? How can we diagnose it? Well, a couple things. What we'll see is there is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. There's no neutrality. Okay, now, when you embrace onist assumptions, what happens? Well, we blur the creator-creature distinction. We've heard about that. We begin to discard what we call mediating institutions. Parents, associations, churches, other types of business kinds of situations, mediating institutions. De Tocqueville talked about this 200 years ago. We begin to then vest sovereignty only in the state. We begin to eliminate a true justification for morality. And what's the bottom line? We absolutize man. That's where oneism leads. Now, all this is deeply problematic. Why? Because it centers sovereignty in mankind, either in the state or in the individual, rather than God. And when that onist move occurs, it constricts and categorizes religious liberty to the status of simply a permissive activity instead of an inalienable right. Professor Steve Smith, who teaches at San Diego, puts it this way. The bottom line is that actual legal and political jurisdiction sovereignty now belongs to the state, period. The church, this is important for those who are believers, the church will ultimately enjoy as much freedom or immunity and only as much as the state sees fit to allow. Does that sound familiar in what's going on in our newspapers today? Smith goes on, if there's no true transcendental, in other words, if oneism ascends, he says this, having dismissed the possibility of any more transcendent ethical standard, modern legal thinkers have nothing to appeal to except humanity and human experience. In other words, some part of the creation. When this happens culturally, how do we know it? What are the telltale signs? When a culture lacks a true transcendental, when oneism is in play? Well, you'll see increasingly that what the culture calls evil will be rooted not in ethics, but in metaphysics. So, the body and passions. Plato made this move. We got to get rid of it. It's all about ideas. Rousseau tells us it's culture, romanticism. We got to get back to nature. Authority figures, psychodynamic people like Freud and so forth. Marx, of course. The problem here is economics. Or recently, Heidegger and the technology management people, existentialists. Now, when that move is made, what happens? Well, I don't really have expertise in those areas. So we need what? Experts. And so you see increasingly we're going to be governed by elites. That's a oneist move. So what do we have? The disciplines become normative. For example, the economist, the psychologist, the biologist, and so forth, the physicist. How do you diagnose this? How do you detect and unearth oneist assumptions that affect your lives and our positive law? Well, ask very simple question, 3 words. By what standard? By what standard? Here's how one Supreme Court justice answered the question being, how do judges judge? Here's what Justice Cardozo said. He said, history, or custom, or social utility, or some compelling sentiment of justice, or sometimes perhaps, my favorite, a semi-intuitive apprehension of the pervading spirit of our law must come to the rescue of the judge. That's the technical term for that is gobbledygook. It means nothing. It's really prefiguring this notion in 1965. Justice Douglas told us about emanations formed by penumbras. Says the right of privacy is in the Constitution. Well, sort of. It's by emanations formed by penumbras, which Justice Scalia later said, that's more suitable for seances than constitutional law. Yeah, pretty much. There is in reality no standard here. What functions as the transcendent authority is really part of the created order. As C.S. Lewis said, the ruler can't measure itself. It has to have something other than itself to measure itself. And so we must know the moves of these idols, these schemes, as they work in the public square. So, in sum, let me explain. If Paul's cosmology is true, if twoism is true, then man, humanity, is created by God, and thus he is defined by God, and therefore is a religious creature inherently. And therefore the purpose of the collective humanity, the state, must be derived from that created reality. And that purpose must be to protect that which the Creator bestows. Therefore, human law, positive law, does not confer fundamental rights. Rather, it's designed to protect them. How would that look legally? Well, the most influential thinker in the founding of the United States was this guy from Pembroke College, William Blackstone. Oxford Dawn, he says, the principal aim of society is to protect individuals in the enjoyment of those absolute rights which were vested in them by the immutable laws of nature. That's parlance for the living God. Now, how would we talk about that politically? How would we translate that concept? Well, maybe like this. Why do we have the state? Well, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain, that is to say, fixed, inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That is a twoist understanding of political theory. And accordingly, if you're twoist, it follows, as Marcello Pera, former president of the Italian Senate, who's an agnostic, by the way, puts it this way. He says, basic human rights must be seen as a gift of God. They must be understood as the properties of men as human beings rather than as citizens. They are a possession not at the mercy of legislators, but prior to the law, and hence are pre-political and non-negotiable. These human rights must be, he says, religiously cherished. That is a twoist understanding of the human person and their dignity and rights. Now, in contrast, if we reject Paul's cosmology, if we accept it by intention or default oneism, then man is merely at best a political animal, not in an Aristotelian sense, but merely a creature of the state. What does that look like politically? Have we ever tried that? Yes. So we see Rousseau. Notice, the source of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No group, parents, association, churches, mediating institutions, no group, no individual may exercise authority not emanating from it. Wow. Now, when you inject steroids in it, you get stuff like this. Another failed Italian, El Duce. Mussolini said, for the fascist, all is comprised in the state. And nothing spiritual or human exists, much less has any value, outside the state. The fascist state, the unification and synthesis of every value, interprets, develops, and potentiates, that would be a worldview, the whole life of the people. Bad moves based upon idolatry. Now, a corollary to Paul's cosmology really focuses on this question, what is man? That's why he addresses human sexuality in the context of cosmology in Romans 1. You see, we can't adequately evaluate what does man do until we understand what man is for. And that's a cosmological, creational norm question. Paul is telling us that man enjoys a fixed human nature reflecting a design and a purpose, a telos. This too is crucial for moral reasoning. Now, in contrast, oneism as applied today denies a fixed human nature. Why? Because it denies a distinction between creator and the creation. And this has implications also for our social ordering. As Charles Murray puts it, he says, the advocates of the welfare state in both Europe and the United States reject this view, substituting instead the belief that human nature can be changed. That was the great Marxist project, you see. Brad Watson puts it this way. He says, it was in their rejection of natural law, a law above the law, that Justice Holmes and other judges broke not only with the founding and Lincoln, but with the very notion that humans are creatures with a certain type, with transcendent purposes and ends that do not change with time. That is derivative from twoism, not oneism. And until we recognize and operate understanding that mankind has a determinate and fixed nature, which, by the way, is the basis for equality under the law, there's a lot of clamor about equality. But if you deny human nature, there can be no equality. What happens if you reject this, it requires the state must change its role. Matt Spalding puts it this way. The denial of human nature on the individual changes the purpose of government on the collective. And the inevitable result is we change what we mean by rights. Rights are asserted as claims simply for government benefits and entitlements. That redefines the notion of equality. Now, there's a corollary here, too, and it's crucial. This cultural clash engendered by oneism operating via the idol of the state means that religion will always be the target of supposedly neutral statist rulers. Roger Trigg, a friend of mine teaching at Oxford now, puts it this way. He says, religion is always a target of totalitarian regimes. Why? The reason is that religion provides an alternative system of influence to that of the state, proposing an authority to which the state should be subservient. Religion, he's meaning Christianity here, by the way, it threatens to restrict the power of the state, and its leaders are judged by a set of standards they themselves cannot control. Well, totalitarians don't like that, and so you see crackdowns and so forth. Ben Weicker puts it this way. He says, since they cannot allow a transcendent lawgiver, they seek an alternative source of moral order. They attempt to ground morality in anything but God. That is to say, in the creation. That's what oneism does. What does that look like historically? Well, if not God, then what? Totalitarian sovereign, Hobbes. Social agreement, bad part of Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes. Pleasure and happiness, utilitarians, Bentham and Mill. The stronger, let's just get right to it, Nietzsche. Or tolerance, postmodernity, but we will tell you what you'll tolerate, you say. He concludes, the one common element in this moral menagerie is the rejection of the fact that morality is defined by the way, the higher law, and conformity to a moral order created and defined by God. All this, we talked about oneism has many manifestations. That's true, but there's the guts of it. This was the issue for understanding and explaining two basically congruent revolutions, the French and the United States. We see here 100 years after the French Revolution, a parliamentarian expressing buyer's remorse. He puts it this way. The revolution puts the human reason as sovereign in the place of the law of God. From this flows all the rest, especially the pride and rebellion, which is the source of the modern state. The state has taken over everything. The state has become your God. Bavinck saw this would be the case, the great Reformed thinker. He said, the state becomes the great source of all rights, the creator and shaper of society. He saw the move, and he understood what would happen. And so the watershed issue is this. Are man's rights granted by the permissive will of the state, or are mankind's rights inalienable, derived from the Lord God? Twoism answers that question definitively and correctly. This is why humanity needs to understand this if we're going to understand the peril and the advantages. And yet, what about today? Isn't today the groovy time of individual civil rights? We have the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Aren't human rights being multiplied and trumpeted and protected? Well, not if you're a faithful and orthodox florist or photographer or pharmacist or t-shirt printer or a baker. In each case, those people were coerced to celebrate and support what the scripture says is an inherently evil act. Pay up or close your business. Now, thank God we've been able to push back on that. We've had a lot of victories lately, both here and abroad. But there's the clash. Why? Because the fundamental idolatry Paul describes in contrasting oneism and twoism expresses itself in a very potent way, particularly over the last century. It influences and operates in our culture and thus influences what it means to be human. G.K. Beale, the great commentator, put it this way. He said, the fundamental idolatry described in the Bible lies also at the heart of varied modern idolatries, the idolatry of the self. The self is set at the center of existence as a God. Ultimate significance is found in godlike individual autonomy, self-set goals and boundaries. And the greatest damage and the greatest impact of this idolatry wrongly answers the question, what is man? And the wrong answer is most exemplified in sexual behavior. That's echoing Romans 1. Again, my friend Burnside says, in biblical thought, sexual relationships can be used either to create community or to destroy community. Twoism, oneism. Sexual order helps to create relational order. And sexual disorder leads to relational disorder. Romans 1 tells us to expect that exactly. Now, here's part of the problem. The pagans understand this. The Christians often do not. Too bad. For example, at Sex Week a few years ago at Yale, one of the presenters put this: you have to have one partner under this one God system. We maintained that for 2,000 years, i.e. under Christianity. But now we have a certain openness. We're coming up on a new pantheistic age. I like all the gods and goddesses. And what's, of course, the therefore? Therefore, I can have many sexual partners. As a pagan move. The idol of self, by the way, must become increasingly self-consciously religious. Why? Because its ethic is rooted in theology. What is that? False worship. Remember that circle I drew? Right? Worship and service leads to behavior. Now they're going to retrograde this thing and start talking about, oh, wait a minute, I am really spiritual. I'm really religious. So we see, for example, a few years ago, James Fry publishing the hubristically named book, The Final Testament of the Holy Bible. Wow, that's kind of interesting. You have the New Testament, the Old Testament, and the Final Testament. Here's what he says. I've edited it. You'll see why. I call it Perversion Gets Religion. Of course it does. It's religious inherently. Love and laughter and effing are what makes life better. God doesn't care about the petty dramas that mean so much to us. God doesn't care what we say or who we F or what we do with our bodies or who we love or who we marry. Says who? Well, when this stuff's in the atmosphere, what do you get? Another failed Italian. I'm Italian. I can bash the Italians. So here you see the wealthy first lady, former first lady of France. Monogamy is terribly boring. I am faithful to myself. I am monogamous from time to time, but I prefer polygamy and polyandry. Perfectly consistent with oneness. We see this coming up in the law where I live and move and have my being. So we have no-fault divorce schemes. We have adoption laws that focus on, it sounds good, right? The best interest of the child, irrespective of biology, irrespective of the parents. And so what happens is the law begins to approve these things. Romans 1:32. I ask Christians this all over the world. I say, what's the nature of sexuality? They would say, sexuality is individualist, private, consent's the rule, pleasure is the purpose. And none of those are completely biblical. Yet, everyone tips to them, particularly the younger crowd. Oh yeah, that's what sex is. Sure, on onist assumptions, not on twoist assumption. Recall Paul. Paul says idolatry drives these practices to be approved. They must be driven to be approved. And so, just down the street here, a gentleman named Stamp Corbin, under the last administration, he was the national chair appointed by the president of the LGBT Leadership Council. What does he tell us? Think Romans 1:32. He says, the most insidious word that is constantly used in our movement is tolerance. I do not want to be tolerated. What I want, and I hope the community at large wants, is acceptance. That's right, approval and respect for my sexual orientation. So what are the cultural implications of this onist model as it applies to humanity and particularly to sexuality? Well, let's talk about linguistic implications, or how do we dialogue? What's the role of language? Sometimes we jump over this. I think it's foundational. What's the role of language? If I call my car water, that's one thing. If I place my water in my garage and close the door, and the next day I go out to my garage and open the door, will I be greeted by a puddle? No. And if I think I will, I need to have my head examined, right? No. Calling my car water doesn't convert it into being water. Do we have magic words? Is that what reality is about? Incantations? Bishop Tom Wright puts it this way. He says, we are not, after all, defined by whatever longings and aspirations come out of our hearts. despite the remarkable rhetoric of our times. In the area of human well-being, that is the road to radical instability. And in the area of theological beliefs, it leads to Gnosticism, as our mentor Peter Jones has been telling us for decades now. So we need to ask some key questions about this. What is mankind? What is mankind with respect to sexuality? Does biology matter? Is biology bigotry, which oneism is telling us these days? Are we simply, as one person said, meat skeletons with accidental and incidental flesh between our legs? I'm quoting. Is that all we really are? Are we mere expressive individuals? We can do whatever we want. By the way, they need to really deal with Roger Scruton and Charles Taylor at that point, who have annihilated the notion of expressive individualism. And let's get really basic. What about love? What is it? Is it externally focused, other-oriented, self-giving? Or is it internally focused, self-focused, self-taking, doing it my way? And how does language attach to what we call real reality? What's really real? Do we best conceive of the human person as nothing more than a protean Mr. Potato Head, where distinctions and design are irrelevant at best or illusory at worst? And therefore, must those obviously and evident distinctions and designs, must they be made to conform or submit to mere subjective desires? Must we try to erase them publicly? And then, by the way, if we erase them, must we then enforce the erasures against third parties, coercing them to bow the knee to someone else's subjective desires? And if you make that move, are we really saying that will trumps being? Will trumps design? And if so, doesn't that mean that power is the only real operative driver as to the culture, as to sexuality? Interesting dialogue. Nancy Pearcey says that under all the hype about sex as fun and game is actually a fundamental despair. And then she quotes a former lesbian. Wait a minute, is that even possible? Can you be like a former lesbian? Absolutely. There's thousands. Melinda Selmas, who's not only a former lesbian, she's a Christian now. She says this: beneath all the pageantry of free sex and self-love, there is a fundamental belief that the body doesn't mean anything, that it is insignificant, literally, signifying nothing. You can do whatever you want with it. She says, this is her quoting her, you can pleasure it with a vacuum cleaner, or you can give it away to anyone for any reason. It's sort of a wet machine, a tool you can use in exchange for whatever purpose suits your fancy. Real reality and real language, however, actually matter. So what are the societal and implications? What are the relational implications? Well, when sex is reduced to an exchange of pleasures, what happens? The other and the other's personality become a burden. Remember, we asked the question, what's love? Is it other-oriented or is it self-focused? Well, if we reject the body, if we reject love being external, the other person, the other, because there's all one, it doesn't really matter. So Selmes continues, if the purpose of sexuality is mere pleasure, sooner or later the other person, with all their personality, their own separate desires, is going to become burdensome. The ideal then becomes no names, just sex. The partners use each other to gain a particular pleasure, trying as much as possible to remain totally separated in their own realms of subjective experience. Now note, this conception, no pun intended, this conception of relationship latently alters how we conceive of freedom and choice. Because we look at that phenomenon in the world and we go, oh, then what's freedom? What's choice? Dr. Jennifer Roback Morris, who used to live here in San Marcos, she's since moved to Louisiana, says this: if we define freedom as getting the outcomes we want, such as pleasure, we can't remain in the relationships and still be free. This definition of freedom places freedom and relationship in opposition to one another. Again, ordering society on behalf of humanity. It places a higher value on autonomy than on relationship. And the only way to resolve the conflict between autonomy and relationship is to end the relationship. Os Guinness comments, he says, even relationships now are renewable in short-term increments. The delete button is always only a click away. Today in America, when till death do us part has shrunk to as long as love lasts, even marriages are now severed with a text message. This stuff matters. The burdensome other, radical autonomy. What about the medical implications and the healing art implications? 3.5 decades ago, Oliver O'Donovan addressed this issue and got it exactly right. He says, gender ideology, which is squarely a onist expression, he says, gender ideology raises in a sharper form the question of the use of medicine as a social instrument, an instrument of social management. Why? For in conceding that there is no medical rationale for this surgery, why? Because it attacks a healthy physiology in order to satisfy the demands of an unhealthy psychology. You see what's going on? We're attacking healthy tissue because of something that's disordered in the mind. Gender ideology overtly overrides the traditional limitation of medical ethics, that invasion into the patient's body ought to be intended to do body good. Of course, transsexual surgery is certainly intended to do the patient good, but it is not a medical good. The patient's body was not meant to be an instrument that could be disposed of simply by desire. He says, not everything to which people will consent or which they will even demand is the right thing for medicine to undertake. And he gives the reason why. For Western medicine is premised on the principle of Western Christian culture. Peter's point last night. This is an attack on Western culture which emanated from the Western Christian tradition. Those who would say we can't have Christian culture really need to study this. You must have Christian culture or you have medicine that does that. Which is what? That bodily health is a good to be pursued and valued for its own sake. So oneism doesn't value the human body, doesn't value the human good in that way. And as Joseph said this morning, where are the hermeneutical breaks for this rationale? If we can do whatever our desires are and make medical personnel do what our desires are, does that actually promote the common good? Is it good science? Is it good medicine? What are the limiting principles, if anything? Consider Monica and Caleb. That's Monica. She has 9 other children. Caleb is one of her children. She's decided that she's attracted to Caleb. She's abandoned her other children by multiple partners, and they have a sexual relationship. They've both been convicted of incest in New Mexico. But that's what she really wants to do. She feels it's right in her heart. Nick O'Halloran from the UK believes that 4 inches below his thigh is not really his. So he's seeking to have his leg amputated because that's his real desire. It's called apotemnophilia. It's a mental disorder. But now it's becoming like, well, that's okay. We have this woman, and I apologize, but this woman wants to be like a cartoon woman with a 13-inch waist. So she's had 6 ribs surgically removed. I just want to be that person. The trans-aged. Here's a guy in his 50s who abandoned his wife and children and now tells people that he is a 6-year-old, and this couple took them in to let them play with their 9-year-old daughter. That's going to have a good outcome, isn't it? But again, philosophically, theologically, how do you oppose that on a onist assumption? There's Chloe Jennings White. She's actually a very able-bodied person, but when she was 4, she saw her aunt. And her aunt had braces on, and she wanted them too. So she is searching for a surgeon who will sever her sciatic nerve to render her paraplegic. She just haven't raised the money yet. You heard Joseph talk about blinding. Well, here's the person he's talking about, Jules Schubing. Her therapist numbed her eyes, and poured drain cleaner into them. Attacking healthy tissue because of someone's desire. That's the point O'Donovan's made years ago. Could it be even weirder? Yeah, here's the New York Magazine talking about what's like to date a horse. And by the way, that's not bestiality. Oh, you're just so old. It's zoophilia. Zoophilia. That's an ongoing thing that happens here. Okay? By the way, let me take an excursus here. You've heard over and over again, well, this is immutable. I told you about Melinda Selmace. Of course, we know Rosaria Butterfield, a friend of Truth Exchange, and so forth. That is a fake claim. Don't let anyone use that as a predicate saying, well, I was born that way. My sexual orientation is immutable. Not true at all. And guess what? The left is starting to get it. Mark Regnerus, who is a believer, teaches at the University of Texas, sociologist, says this: today, scholars are increasingly recognizing that sexuality and desire can be cultivated. Immutability, a foundation for legal shifts in LGBT rights as recently as 2015, seems on the way out. It does not adequately capture the complexity of sexuality or give credit to the social directedness of desire. He quotes, just up the street, Jane Ward, who's at UC Riverside, a professor there of gender and queer politics. She says, if we all really believe that sexual orientation was congenital or present at birth, then no one would ever worry that social influences could have an effect on our sexual orientation. But I think that in reality, we all know that sexual desire is deeply subject to social, cultural, and historical forces. The culture matters. The culture outside the church matters. My friends John Stonestreet and Brett Kunkel put it this way. They say the American Psychological Association, which is gay affirming, recognizes the lack of scientific evidence for the claim that homosexuality is genetic. The APA says, although much research has examined the possible genetic, hormonal development, social, and cultural influences on sexual orientation, no findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor or factors. Then they quote Martin Duberman, who is an LGBT activist. He says, no good scientific work establishes that people are born gay or straight. It's a myth that was used to promote an agenda. It doesn't exist. It's a political notion, not a biological or medical notion. Okay, what are the legal and policy implications with respect to that? Notice what's happening in this particular area. We're using the law not to draw lines, but to create reality. The law is being used not only ethically, but metaphysically, to say what being is, to say what reality is. That's a problem. We see this with the so-called sexual orientation, gender identity laws. These are destructive because what they will do is erase the legal recognition, not only of what it means to be a woman, but a whole host of categories that reflect reality. Stella Morabito writes in the Federalist, brilliant writer, former CIA analyst, very sharp mind, puts it this way. Once you basically redefine humanity as sexless, you end up with a dehumanized society in which there can be no legal mother or father or son or daughter or husband or wife without the permission of the state. This gives the state unprecedented power to micromanage families. Another commentator says the state can make decisions regarding how parents educate their children, what medical treatment they use, what disciplines they enforce. The state can decide who counts as a child's parent. The state saw its role, it used to be, as recognizing the natural reality. But when gender is denaturalized, parenthood will also be denaturalized. So what's happening is a twoist creational, pre-political institution is now being subsumed under the political order. Let's see if I can simplify this. If two men are deemed the equivalent of a married mother and father, kinship is then irrelevant. The family is no longer a natural reality, it's simply a legally constructed one. The state will determine what comprises a family, a mother, a father. Therefore, the body and what it signifies under oneism must be legally silenced. Why? Because the body, biology, repudiates the notion of liberty as defined under oneism. Biology becomes an enemy of liberty under oneism. And so what we see then is just a host of all kinds of things. By the way, is fertility now pathology? This idea that we're going to give hormone suppressants and then cross-sex hormones to young people before puberty, that makes them sterile forever, right? That's how the biology works. So is fertility now pathology, something to correct? Why are we treating mental health challenges with surgery upon healthy physiology? And then, of course, you have all kinds of permutations here, privacy issues, bathrooms, that sort of thing. Equality between the sexes. This argument that we need to have equality among the sexes, and that's certainly true in some categories. But, think about it. The NCAA, the PGA, the Olympics are now letting people who take hormones to compete in the other categories. Now, if I take hormones and go compete against women, I would be called a cheater. If I take hormones and compete against women and claim I'm a woman, I'm a champion. It's word magic, okay? So what is mankind really? That's the reality of twoism. So there's a whole lot of permutations here. You talk about Hitler's monsters, there's a lot of monsters right here too. Not the people, the philosophy, the ideology. I don't want to be misunderstood. But how can this mutually reinforcing destructive pattern be broken? I think the answer is simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. Revitalizing a robust anthropology. And that sort of anthropology must first be firmly rooted in design or telos. That can only be done as informed by twoism, the true cosmology, real reality. Only by knowing what mankind is for can society rightly direct what mankind ought to do. And twoism informs that exercise. So let's talk about what it would look like if we reaffirmed and revitalized this robust anthropology. What is man? What does it mean to be human? Well, he's a creature. There's a fundamental creature-creator distinction that exists metaphysically under universal twoism. Mankind is dependent. We talked about that. Mankind is not autonomous. And the implications is there's a law above man. Authority and duty is always derivative, though real. Second of all, mankind alone is imago Dei, creating human exceptionalism. 5 implications to that. Mankind as imago Dei is social, contra to libertarianism. Mankind derives from a society, it's called the Holy Trinity, in order to participate in society. And thus, the family is a key, pre-political, foundational, mediating institution. Second implication. Mankind is rational, contra to postmodernity and oneism's advaita, as Peter said last night. It was in my notes before he said it, so you were on the same page. It's good. Not two. Mankind is designed to make distinctions, including empirical distinctions, to reason, to communicate receptively, transmissionally, to reflect, to evaluate. Creation has meaning. Why? Because the Creator is the Word, inherently rational, and thus the creation itself has an inherent meaning. That meaning exists and can be understood. Thirdly, mankind is moral, contra to the naked public square, thinking like John Rawls, public reason. No, and we covered that earlier. No value-free zone exists. No neutrality exists. Every act and every thought says either God is or God is not. Quoting Cornelius Van Til from 1931. Every thought, every word, every action says God is or God is not at bottom. Fourth, mankind are worshipers. Not only are they moral, but they're worshipers, contra to the secularists. Mankind cannot not worship. Every move is not only a moral move, every move is a religious move. And the question is, does that move faithfully reflect the religion, or is it irreligious? Does it manifest the spirit of truth, or does it manifest idolatry and the lie? Mankind are not animals. Isn't that weird we have to say that today? but contra to environmentalism that tells us that Gaia is all that exists and we're a parasite or a virus, directly from oneism. No, the true humanity stands in opposition. Third, it means mankind is male and female. There's a metaphysical male and female. There exists an intrinsic complementarity effectuated by design and intention, contra to egalitarianism and the faux equality so rampant in our culture. This means understanding it properly. We don't have time to tease it all out, but that allows us to understand various roles and responsibilities, privately, socially, as well as publicly. Finally, mankind is to be mission-focused. There exists both a cultural mandate as well as a great commission, contra to the nihilists who basically say that our only job is to populate heaven. No, mankind is not on this earth merely to occupy space and consume oxygen, treading the cultural waters, waiting for some supposed cataclysmic event. There is a purpose, there is a design, there is an aim. History does matter because truth matters. And Christians in particular are to be missional in the sense that they are to turn the cultural waters here. It's the nature of what my friend Andy Sandlin says, cosmic redemption. Mankind is saved from something for something. Mankind is not only a beneficiary of salvation, he's an agent of it. The light does dispel the darkness. We are to be fruitful and to multiply, and we're to make disciples. We're to exercise dominion over the rest of creation, and we're to teach the nations to observe all that Christ taught us. We're to develop the earth's potential, and so on and so forth. That's what we're called to do. So I focused on humanity in the most emblematic form, the notion of sexual autonomy, which is emblematic of oneism. And here's what happens. When we don't do that correctly, we end up with dehumanization. I have patients who come and say, I want to abort because if this baby is born, it will be a Gemini, and I want a Libra. Who are you to judge? Unless there's a standard above the person. You see, the idol of choice, which is oneism, always worships on the altar of death. A heretical view of man or of God will inevitably lead to false worship, which will give you a heretical view of law and justice and ethics. Oneism says, if the self or the state is an idol, then so too law and justice will be idolatrous. The exaltation of the self leads precisely to the cultural idolization of the self's choices. And when the self is God, then the state will be seen to codify the self's choices. But the idol of choice ultimately produces tyranny, not liberty. Well, what about this? I hear this a lot as I travel the world. Objection! That's not a gospel issue. Have you ever heard that? That's not this is just ugly and messy and stuff. It's not a gospel. Let's just focus on gospel. They say it like that, gospel. You know, Justice Scalia, who was an acquaintance, friend of mine, he'd say, when I evaluate clerks, I look at their transcript, and if they have a course that says law and something, they're not for my chambers. Law and economics, law and society, law and jello. He said, I don't want any of them. Well, be careful when you get into what I wrote 20 years ago about the hyphenated thing. Don't be hyphenated. Gospel-centered. Gospel mission. Be careful of that. Let's just take marriage. Marriage, according to Twoism, is the exclusive venue to express human sexual intimacy. It's a creational norm. It's a creational norm he designed and he stipulates. Marriage is not a creation of the state. God defends his ordinance. He expects us to do the same. Why? Because it incarnates the relationship between Christ and the church. It signifies his redemption, Ephesians 6. And every deviation from this creational sexual norm miscommunicates this fundamental redemptive reality. It obscures the gospel truth itself. For example, sexuality is a gospel issue. Prostitution says that Christ and the church was a mere economic exchange. Fornication says that Christ and the church had no commitment. Adultery says that one of the two lacked fidelity. Polygamy says there are, like many churches. And sodomy says that there are two Christs or two churches. And then, of course, bestiality says that his image is not redeemed. Every deviation from the creational norm obscures portraying Christ in the church, which is redemptive. And so our focus must be that which is true from the beginning, implying, presupposing, and prescribing twoism. That's Matthew 19. From the beginning, which the resurrected and ascended Christ says now is a part of all things becoming new. Now I get it. In these types of discussions, some positions are accused of or labeled of being on, the wrong side of history, whatever that tweet means. However, it's vitally important to be on the right side of reality, to be on the right side of real reality, to be on the right side of truth. Because it's truth that's non-negotiable. It's truth that's exchanged for the lie. It's vitally important to be on the right side of truth and not exchange any of it at any point for the lie. Accordingly, we are not so much or primarily against, for example, same-sex marriage, but we are for human flourishing. And the best option for that flourishing and the best option for societal order occurs when twoist reality and twoist sexuality and its attendant morality and culture, as designed and blessed by God, is protected, is promoted, and is propagated. When we exalt the self or the state through oneism, we abandon God. And ironically, when we abandon God, man will be forgotten. John says, little children, keep yourself from idols. For good reason, he says that. How? By rejecting the oneist pagan lie, worshiping the creation, and instead embracing the twoist gospel truth, worshiping the Creator, to whom be glory, majesty, dominion, and authority before all time, and now, and forever. Amen, says Jude. That's the twoist truth, and that's the best way to promote humanity, human dignity, human flourishing, and thereby the common good. Thank you so much for your kind attention on this Saturday morning.